Today it's blueberry strawberry rye flour waffles. And James is going to be talking about Revolution, Mexico, 1910 to 20.
A little over 100 years ago.
Yeah. There you are.
Anything you want to
Nope.
talk about?
Nope. Just your book.
Okay.
It's a little bit dewy, the seat.
Oh, is it? I didn't notice.
I did.
Revolution, Mexico, 1910, 1920. I'm trying to sound like some idiot announcing a sports event. The Olympics. I can never do it quite justice. This is written by a guy called Ronald Atkin, born in 1931. This book was published in 1969, so he's about 38. When the book came out, and he was old enough to know better. He spent most of his working life in newspapers as a copy boy, junior reporter, sports and general sub-editor, and even for the Royal Gazette in Bermuda, of all places, as parliamentary correspondent. During his 5 years in Bermuda, Mr. Atkin first became interested in Mexico, so I guess it's not that Bermuda. Bahamas. Well, Bermuda's quite a ways away. Then Mr. Atkin first became interested in Mexico, and he traveled widely in the country, collecting material for this book. Most recently, he's been working on the Observer and the Daily Mail, which is not the classiest.
He traveled to get the information for the book. What a loser.
I know. Boots on the ground. You know, something that happened like roughly.
If you're hiking, you might want to go actually to the place that you're writing about, or something like that. If you're writing history,
yeah, it doesn't make much sense. I mean, the last events of the revolution happened almost 50 years before this thing was written. So there'd be a few people alive, quite a few people alive, like Pancho Villa's wife was maybe still alive.
sure, and he can't talk to them like on the phone or whatever.
They had phones back then in 1969. I survived the 60s, all of them actually, and there were phones back then. I can remember when we first hit Saskatchewan, maybe second time, maybe as late as 64. They still had the phones that were like this, and you get the operator, the person that you wanted to phone directly, so on and so forth. But it was semi-civilized back then. And now he's a press officer to the Canadian Government Travel Bureau in London. Mr. Atkin is married with 2 sons. So he's basically just a journalist. I'm not going to say a copy boy because he got well beyond that sort of stuff, but a journalist. Don't mention his education at all. So this is English thing printed in Great Britain by Western Printing Services Limited, Bristol. It was published 69 by Macmillan and Company Limited. One of the better conservative prime ministers of England came from that family. I think the publishing family, Harold Millen, kind of like a left-wing conservative, if there's such a thing, relatively left. So this guy comes from a British. He's prejudiced against the Americans, and particularly Woodrow Wilson, who was the president for much of the Mexican Revolution. First couple of years, what was his name? Howard Taft. Anyway, kind of glitching on his name. Still trying to wake up. It takes me a long time with the meds that I'm not to wake up. So Taft. It was Taft, not Harding. Again, Harding was elected 20. So got some interesting pictures in here. It's really a rogues gallery of people. The revolution was a spit show. Yeah, I might be using rhyming slang. Just an amazing spit show. So here's the dude that started it all off. And see, he's just got dressed to the nines, maybe the 90s. Porfirio Diaz, he was basically the dictator in 1910. This is a relative of his, as I recall, Felix Diaz, who played a not very nice role during the revolution, kind of a reactionary role. Bernardo Reyes, kind of a silly fool. This guy was a well-intended kind of guy. Madero, he was maybe a little too pacifistic. He ended up being murdered, or as this guy says, assassinated. So he wouldn't get rid of flunkies like this. He's called Pancho Villa. I'd say he was maybe bipolar or something like that, and untreated. And if a bipolar person has guns and stuff like that, guns and ammo, or commands people who've got guns and ammo, they can be very dangerous. So they called him Pancho. I'd call him Paunchy. It's amazing, you know. Got quite the gut on him. This guy, not so much. Another one of these almost like peasant leaders. I know, because look at these skunks. They killed lots of people. Emiliano Zapata, dressed to the 900s. This guy, you know, like ordinarily, like Keith Richard, he'd have the silver down the side of his pants, the silver kind of like medals or whatever they are. And of course, he has to have the bandoleros or whatever they're called, lots of ammunition on his chest. I just aimed for their chest and hope all the ammunition would go
No kidding,
at the same time. You know, what an idiot. Big sombrero, you know, like as though they, you know, like they're places where the sun shines hotter than in Mexico. Yeah, there's Pancho Villa's wife. She looks almost civilized. Orozco, he was a real rascal. Here's a guy getting shot. It's awful. You know, like he's got his dog there. I don't know what they do, whether they'd shoot the dog or just let the dog lap up the blood. So here's Pancho Villa bargaining for his life. They should have shot the guy, but he got away with it, and he killed so many people. It's absolutely scary. And he's supposed to be a good guy, I think, to most people. Here's some poor women, armed Zapatistas. They're armed. They have to a restaurant. They have to have their rifles alongside of them. And that sombrero, I mean, wow, that's just ridiculous. In Sanborn's, the celebrated Mexico City restaurant. So you can see these women saying, geez, I don't want to do anything wrong. They might shoot me. They might subject me to a fate worse than death before they shoot me. It's just awful. Here's, you know, like the right-wingers were, if anything, worse. So Huerta killed lots of people. He was a reaction to the revolution. Carranza, crazy idiot, but he was kind of like on the left wing. Alvaro Obregón, maybe a little bit more sensible. This guy apparently was at least a sensible fighter. Felipe Angeles, a lover of horses. I like Felipe, lover of horses. And that horse seems to love him back, maybe. He's not bucking him off. But Obregón's the guy who beat up particularly Pancho Villa, and he ended up heading up Mexico, maybe relatively competently. I think this is a Spanish rendering of O'Brien. He came from, it looks like Irish ancestry, maybe with a little bit of Spanish and or indigenous mixed in. Shell damage in Mexico City after the tragic 10 days. Here's Fatso Villa, Panchi Villa with a couple American guys. Here he is with Zapata, There's the Pattas. I think he's got those silver medals or whatever they are down the side of his pants, and the huge big sombrero. You know, it's as though you know, like the sun in Mexico is a red giant and not the wee little sun that we've got shining on the rest of us. And there's Ponche Villa, a couple of real skunks. Here's maybe not quite a dozen people hanged by Villa. His general practice. Oh no, these are villistas hung by Murguia. So he didn't want to waste bullets on these idiots and stuff like that, but he shouldn't have been hanging them. So there's Obregon, Ponche Villa, a little Ponche there, and Blackjack. Is this Blackjack Pershing? Yeah, American guy. So he, they say invaded, but it was more like an expeditionary force going into Mexico. So there's all sorts of stupidity happening during the revolution. Like, you know, like Warren Zevon wrote a song, and not a very sensible song. It's actually not that good, about Wilson, the American president, having the American army intervene, maybe in the Navy as much as anything, intervene in Mexico, Veracruz, Cross. And I don't know, he was kind of supporting left-wingers. You know, like the way it's presented to me is like American right-wing intervention, but he's actually supporting the revolution, the more sensible parts of the revolution. But you can see along here, you know, Brownsville Station used to do smoking in the boys' room back 50 years ago. So Brownsville, across from it, Matamoros, you've got Laredo, Nuevo Laredo, Piedra Negras, and what is it? It's something like Eagle something or other over on the American side, Presidio and Ojinaga, El Paso, and across from it, Ciudad Juarez, and Douglas, and Agua Prieta, and Nogales on both sides, Naco on both sides. I don't think Tijuana and Mexicali figured much with Calmexi, or whatever it's called, Calamex, and San Diego. But in several of these places, Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, for example, there'd be fighting on the Mexican side, but they'd end up shooting up the American side too, in more cases than not by accident. Now, the Americans had a lot of deaths because they'd come and watch the revolution taking place as like a spectator sport. Unfortunately, spectators, a little bit like what happens in Formula One racing, every so occasionally there was collateral damage and spectators would get killed. But people living on the other side, you know, they had to move. In the United States, they'd have to move from wooden dwellings to adobe brick dwellings because the bullets would come, stray bullets would come through onto the American side, and people actually got killed. You know, they had to block up their windows, you know, because they're facing roughly to the south. So ridiculous. And this place, Columbus, I think it was Pancho Villa or Ponche Villa. He actually invaded the United States. Wow, you know, like, what's that about? He killed people up there. And so, you know, the Americans got sick of it. So you get this guy talking as though Woodrow Wilson was a warmonger and all that sort of stuff. He got involved.
Yeah,
in
but
war and what were you going to say?
I was going to say places in Texas and California and whatever, they didn't used to belong to the United States.
Well, way back, but at this point in time, they've been part of the United States for over half a century. Okay, so, except for the Gadsden Purchase, and that was pretty recent. But so Woodrow Wilson, this guy does mention like Theodore Roosevelt when Americans were getting killed and stuff like that. Theodore Roosevelt was basically calling Woodrow Wilson a pacifist because he didn't want to intervene. They did intervene in Veracruz and stuff like that. World War I, geez, I mean the Germans were doing unlimited submarine warfare on a neutral country, United States. You can't do that. When you sink the Lusitania, when you sink an American ship because you're doing a blockade on anything going into England, no, you can't do that. You've committed an act of war. I don't think Woodrow Wilson wanted to go into and settle Germany's hash, and incidentally, he did quite effectively. But this guy calls him. He mentions Woodrow Wilson was the son of a Presbyterian minister or something like that, pastor. Later on, or in another place, he calls him a Puritan. An idiot. It's a typical English. He seems like a left winger or something like that. But sometimes I'm going to be reviewing a book called Hallelujah, and it's written by a guy called Fernau, and it's in the original German. It's not very original, even though it's written originally in German. And it's right-wing criticism of the United States, and again, it mentions things like Puritanism and Calvinism and stuff like that. Wow, it's awful. Americans, it's stunning. It talks about how the Americans handle the natives and stuff like that. Yeah, there was some fighting, and like a lot of natives died, but most of them died of diseases. There was hardly any killing, not on the scale. I understand the Indian Wars were, by the time Fernau gets around to dealing with the Americans, had been over roughly 100 years. Whereas Fernau actually fought in World War II on Hitler's side. And he's talking about how the Americans were killing indigenous people. Oh, bleh, what a stupid idiot. So you can get right-wingers who criticize Americans. So I don't know, when you look at this guy who actually wasn't publishing in the Guardian. Guardian's the crazy buttock newspaper on the left wing in the United States, Manchester Guardian. They're a lot crazier now, I think, than they used to be. But anyway, it's just Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, they're supposed to be the good guys. They're supposed to be the left-wingers. But like almost every revolution since the American Revolution, it was a spit show. The French Revolution, a spit show. The Russian Revolution, a spit show. The Nicaraguan Revolution, a spit show. The Iranian Revolution, a spit show. Lots of people getting killed, whacked. Things basically ending up worse in many cases than they were before. Napoleon spun out of the French Revolution. Lenin starts the Russian Revolution, so-called revolution. It's a coup. He finished it off, really. He's kind of like the Napoleon. He's the one who kind of like a reaction to something like a real revolution. And then, of course, Stalin was even worse. The Nicaraguan Revolution, we've still got Ortega plaguing not just Nicaragua, but potentially the world. What is that, like 40 years later? More than 40 years later, maybe 43 years later. What a skunk. And so the only revolutions, like the first English Revolution, I don't think England wasn't ready. There was some reaction to it, and you had Cromwell, who basically set himself up as a dictator. But I can only think of two revolutions that actually were in the world. I don't really believe in them because they just generally, and when I say generally, it seems like 90% of the time, 95% of the time, don't work. If anything, they're worse. They're not like a zero, they're a negative. So were the English Glorious Revolution brought to England by the Dutch stadtholder, William of Orange, William III, I think he eventually was styled as in England. And the American Revolution. Those are the only two that have worked. And it's been a long time. They were basically the the second and third revolutions in the world. The first one, the first English Revolution, didn't work, and it was a negative, I'd say, at least in many ways. Of course, the Restoration wasn't good either in 1660. But every revolution since then that I've run across or heard of or read about has been at least a zero, and in many cases a negative. So this thing, Obregon, might have ultimately been something like a positive, but the stuff that happened in between, Pancho Villa, it was just a matter of practice. He gets so he's supposed to be a left winger. He's supposed to be a good guy. And yet his practice was you capture soldiers, you just shoot them. It's just a war crime. It might not have been declared a war crime back then. I think it probably would have been. But yeah, you just shoot them. Someone, like I think it was Pancho Villa. Someone's caterwauling, I think he's drunk out in the street. And, I guess Pancho Villa's got a headache. He gets rid of the headache, or at least the cause of it. He goes to the window and shoots the guy dead. Yeah, so, yeah. This happened way too much, and Zapata might not have been much better. His depredations were generally confined to, aside from Mexico City, a state just south of the federal district in Mexico called Morelos or something like that. Villa was all over the place, all over the map. Like I was saying, into the United States. What a stupid bumhead move. What an idiot. And he wants the Americans to be on his side, and he invades a place called Columbus. And he's killing people up there. Lets his soldiers do whatever with whomever, plundering. These idiots, it's basically, you can't have a peasant revolution. These guys are commanding peasants. So they take over Mexico City. And what they do is, one of their generals, he's showing how disdain for right-wingers. So what does he do? He rides his horse up the stairs in a big mansion. What they do is they want to dance in a big mansion's floor. Too slippery for people in there, so they rip up the parquetry or whatever, rip it up. Some fellow is walking around, I guess it's Mexico City. He thinks his portrait is really important. So what he's done, he can't get an artist to render his features, so he just smashes his head through a canvas. Right? So there's the frame, and the canvas is kind of holding his head in place. So, smashing statues and stuff like that. These are considered crimes against humanity, war crimes, as they should be. This is the kind of skunkiness that was happening during the Russian Revolution. You cannot have a revolution of peasants. So, what was another incident that happened? There's one that I wanted to mention, but I'm a little bit sleepy. But can you imagine having to do dental work on Pancho Villa or something like that? If you hurt him or something like that, you'd get shot. It's just crazy stuff. You literally cannot have a revolution of peasants. And so often, I think the majority of revolutions in the world...
Well, if your peasants are passive people, you could. But
if they're
they
passive,
have
they
to
don't
value...
want to do a revolution.
Exactly. They have to have... they have to value education and producing society rather than breaking it down.
Yeah.
And that's
Peasants
kind of
don't value education.
It doesn't really attract revolutionaries. Those kind of people aren't attracted to revolution. So
now there's some people who've been educated, like Stalin. I'm sure a lot of people go, well, that was ignoramus. Hey, almost anyone who'd say that, right or left wing, don't understand. Dude had, to varying degrees, command and control of 6 languages. You try that out, you flunky profs who basically got hardly any control over 2 languages outside of your own. So half of the languages that Stalin had command and control. Like he taught himself English and German to actually read stuff. novels or whatever. He
Yeah,
read a lot of
but
stuff.
I mean, obviously he was a very aggressive personality type. So there's the problem. I mean, you can't have a reformation of society where you say, okay, everyone's going to be equal. Oh, except for me. I'm the big boss, right?
I'm the head honcho.
How does that? That doesn't work
the
at
big
all.
head cheese. Yeah, it doesn't work.
No.
It doesn't work. It's got to be democracy right from the get-go.
Yeah.
You can't have democracy imposed by one big leader. Now, you can have democracy imposed by a democracy by force. You get all sorts of people laughing at George Bush Jr., saying he's bringing democracy to the Middle East. And they were saying over and over again, any number of people, you can't impose democracy by force. And their command of history is so bad, that's actually what the Americans did. 6 years of dictatorship in Germany, and I believe it's 6 years of dictatorship in Japan. And they've still got something like democracy. So, you can get a legacy kind of effect. It's not just imposed on them and it's over when the Americans leave. Now, there was something like a tradition of democracy, particularly in, or at least craving democracy in Germany. Something like a liberal tradition in Japan, which had been erased by the militaries.
That would be the influence of Buddhism, right?
I think Buddhism more than anything else. Shintoism has been a bad influence.
I actually agree with people who said you can't impose democracy in the Middle East.
Well, they were saying anyway. They were making a general statement.
I can't see how that would work in the Middle East.
No, it never
You
worked.
have to have
the
people who actually want it.
Yeah, they don't want democracy. Yeah,
if
the
you
vast
don't
majority
want it,
want
then it's not going to happen.
Yeah. So there are two main traditions amongst, let's say, Arabs in the Middle East. One is pan-Arab nationalism. It was popular for a while. It didn't work out. It was incompetent. It was basically Nazism mixed with communism, starting with Gamal Abdel Nasser, and it didn't work out. We would have thought it would. Communism doesn't work, and Nazism tends to be ruinously rabid when it comes to your neighbors, and so Nasser was ruinously rabid with the Jews, and he paid for it, especially in 1967. So but the mainstream of thought in Arab countries is there's very few people, maybe 10 to 15% who actually believe in democracy. And then there might be 10 to 15% that actually believe in pan-Arab nationalism or Nazi commundom. But the rest, what would that work out to be? Roughly 70% believe in Islam, and Islam doesn't believe in peace. There might be the very occasional relatively pacifistic movement. There might have been something like that in, where was that, Chechnya, up until recently. I'd see it as being more like, how would I put it, kind of like staying out of politics, not so much being pacifistic. Not like the Jains or the Quakers or the Mennonites, the Amish, the Hutterites, and so on and so forth. Now, the vast majority of Muslims believe in jihad, and not just defensive jihad, but offensive jihad.